Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom McBride. I'm the Executive Director of the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association. And on behalf of the association, I want to thank you for your participation in this installment of the NJJA webinar series. With the help and support of the Sherwood Foundation, we've begun expansion of our three core values of education, leadership, and collaboration through a series of webinars and online resources for juvenile justice professionals here in Nebraska. We'd also like to thank Voices for Children in Nebraska for their collaboration in this webinar. For more information on upcoming educational opportunities, please go to our website and sign up for our mailing list. I have a couple of housekeeping items before we begin today. Please make sure your name appears on the right-hand side of your screen as we are noting attendance for this live webinar session. Also, please utilize the chat function on the right side of your screen for all questions. In the interest of time, we ask that you save all your questions for the time outlined by our facilitator. The webinar is being recorded as a resource and will be available to be accessed through njja.org in the near future. More information about that will be sent out to our mailing list. As we begin, this webinar has been approved for 1 hour of attorney CLEs. I'd like to introduce our facilitator for today, Juliet Summers, and everyone that knows Juliet knows.
The caller has joined the conference.
Juliet is the policy coordinator at Voices for Children in Nebraska, research, analysis, and advocacy efforts in the areas of child welfare and juvenile justice. Prior to joining Voices for Children, Juliet served as a public defender representing children and families in the juvenile court of Douglas County. Before that, she taught second grade on the Rosebud Indian Reservation through Teach for America. Juliet holds a law degree from the University of Chicago and a BA in political science from Duke University, and she is a member of the Nebraska Bar. We asked her to present today because in her capacity as policy coordinator at Voices, Juliet has firsthand experience working with Nebraska legislators to pass laws aimed at improving outcomes for our young people charged in the juvenile system in Nebraska. She is a part-time registered lobbyist on behalf of Voices for Children and is here today with us to share the ins and outs of getting a bill across the finish line. We believe this training to be especially informative due in part to the uniqueness of Nebraska's legislative body as the only unicameral in any of the United States. Juliet, thank you for your assistance today, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm really excited to be here today and really appreciate NJJA asking me to share my information with you about the Nebraska Unicameral and how to get a bill across the finish line. Can everyone hear me all right?
The caller,
Pam Loster,
has joined the conference.
If you can't hear me, I don't know how you would know to do this, but you could type "no, I can't hear" into the chat at the bottom. So go ahead, just a couple short things before I launch into it. So if you think of a question as we go along, I'm just going to blast through my information for the most part. If you think of a question as we go, feel free to type it into the chat. If it makes sense to answer it right away, I'll try to do so right then. Otherwise, we'll keep that running queue going to have some time for questions and answers at the end. The other thing I want people to know is I've made my PowerPoint here pretty text heavy. I don't intend to completely read off of it, but I wanted you to know this was intentional so that you can go back to the NJJA website after this presentation is over or in the coming weeks in January once legislative session starts, and you'll still be able to find the information. So no need to take copious notes today. It should be all here for you in the PowerPoint. So, as Tom said, I'm Juliet Summers. My background is in law, and specifically law related to children and juvenile justice. I started working at Voices for Children a couple years ago and have really enjoyed the transition going from the courtroom to the policy table. So having been a public defender, I could kind of see firsthand in individual cases how policies were either really working well for kids and families in Nebraska or really weren't. And the transition to being a policy coordinator for this small nonprofit has been really satisfying personally and professionally for me to be able to try and affect some of those policies on the larger scale. So today I want to share this information with you so that if you are someone who's interested in doing something similar, you have the tools and some of the really nitty-gritty information you need about how to do this in Nebraska, which, as Tom said, is, we have a special and unique system of legislating here. So this policy, or this presentation, is everything you didn't learn in civics class or have forgotten about the Nebraska Unicameral. So a quick roadmap. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Voices for Children so you know what my organization is and does and where we're coming from. We're going to go through an introduction to the background and basics of the Nebraska Unicameral, some just fundamental information you need to know. And then, as I said, the nitty-gritty, the details of legislative advocacy down to like how many copies of things you want to bring to hearings. And finally, ways to stay informed as the legislative session progresses starting in January or as any legislative session would progress in future years. So starting with about Voices for Children. Voices for Children in Nebraska is the independent voice building pathways to opportunity for all children and families through research, policy, and community engagement. This is sort of policy mumbo jumbo, but what it means is we work with public and state leaders to focus on big picture systems in order to remove obstacles and promote opportunities for all children to lead healthy, secure, and fulfilling lives. And as a bit of background, Voices for Children was founded almost 30 years ago, 30 years next year, by Kathy Bigsby Moore, who at the time was a foster parent herself. And she started the organization because as a foster parent, in individual cases, child after child, she kept running into the same problems, having to have the same conversations or arguments with caseworkers and their supervisors. And she finally got sick of that, and if you've ever known or met Kathy, you'll understand that what happened next was she just decided to do something about it. So she founded this organization, starting with child welfare as the initial focus in our foster care system, to try and fight this fight on the big scale, solve some of these problems for all kids across Nebraska rather than one by one in the individual cases for the children she had in her home. So our primary mission statement at Voices for Children and our values are that informed research drives our direction. We start from the data. We start from research into what works for kids and families. And we look at, what do we really know about where we are and what's going on right now. Then we move to the policy piece. So when a policy is good, we support it. When it's harmful, we fight it. And when it's missing, we can work to create it. So we do some research. We look at what's working in Nebraska, what's working elsewhere, what are other states doing. Do we have evidence basis to argue for a particular kind of policy? What has research shown has worked or improved a system? And how can we tweak or change our systems to better support kids? And then the final prong of our value statement is that community engagement is how we support systems change. So that's a little bit of what I'm doing today. We believe that you have to engage with the public. Everyone in Nebraska should be invested in big picture policy as it relates to kids because, as a really practical matter, our kids are our future. And so getting our public systems right for kids is going to set our entire community up for success. We focus in these areas predominantly when it comes to our policy work: child welfare, early childhood, economic stability, physical and behavioral health, and juvenile justice. Obviously, there's a great deal of overlap between all of those, as I'm sure many of you know. We have 2 policy coordinators in the office, and so my role is really to handle predominantly the child welfare and juvenile justice pieces of our policy work. That's my area of expertise, and that's where I am doing the most work with the legislature. So on the research and data, we're missing a picture here of our 2017 or 2016 Kids Count book. But as I mentioned, we start from the data. One thing that our organization does, we have a research and data wing in the office, and what they primarily do is put together Kids Count every year. Kids Count is the most comprehensive data book regarding children in Nebraska. It covers data and statistics in all those issue areas. If you don't have a copy for 2016, the year is almost up, and we will be releasing our next year's data book on January 10th, 2017, that will have the most updated data for 2015-2016 as it relates to kids in those issue areas, so child welfare, education, juvenile justice, health, etc. On this, you should know we are publicly releasing it January 10th. We do a road trip around the state. Our data coordinator tries to get everywhere she's asked to go to present on the data and to share the books around. So if you're interested in getting hard copies of the books, in finding out about our online data sharing system, or getting a presentation on the data, please note my contact information at the end, and we'll be sure to be in touch about that. And on that note, I do want to highlight one important prong of our work is race equity in Nebraska. So if you look at Nebraska's data on children and child well-being overall, we rank pretty highly among the states. We're typically in the top 10 for when it comes to indicators of child well-being, like a relatively low child in poverty rate, a relatively high parental employment rate, et cetera. However, when you drill down into those numbers, it becomes very clear very quickly that not all of our state's kids are benefiting equally from our systems and policies. Our systems and policies aren't serving kids of color in the same way that they're serving white non-Hispanic children. And so last year, for the first time in Kids Count, we published in an index of race and opportunity, really trying to break down those numbers and show how our state is serving kids differently, and we're going to have that in every Kids Count going forward. So that is a little bit about voices. I'm moving on now to the meat of the presentation. We're going to start with the introduction to the unicameral, the kind of what you need to know as a background. So some of this may be familiar to you, or some of you on the phone maybe even be experts in the unicameral. But we'll start with this intro, and then we'll go into what you need to do in order to be a legislative advocate. So we are the only unicameral body in the country. That means every other state has two houses, a Senate and a House, in order to pass legislation. We kept it very simple in Nebraska. We have one House made up of legislators from 49 districts. And so while many other states have hundreds of legislators involved, thousands of bills to deal with, our relatively simple system makes the legislature very accessible to anybody. And another way that we've simplified our process is, much like other states and our federal Congress, we've organized the legislature into standing committees around various public policy areas. So probably most relevantly to this group, there is a Health and Human Services Committee, and there is a Judiciary Committee. And those committees facilitate the first step, the initial process of legislation when a bill is brought. The first stage that it's going to go through is going to be assigned to a committee. So the chair of a committee is very important in deciding which bills are heard on which days in public hearings. And members of each committee become really important as well, because that initial group of about 8 to 10 legislators is going to decide which bills move forward out of those committees to be heard by the entire body of the legislature. I also wanted to mention on this page that, in case you didn't know, Nebraska's unicameral is formally nonpartisan. So it's very easy, obviously, to look up and see the voter registration of your particular representative to know how they self-identify on the political spectrum. But having the legislature itself be nonpartisan means that there are no caucus whips who are determining votes, getting vote counts, deciding what measures pass or fail, which can mean that even though, at least in recent years, our legislative body has looked conservative in terms of their individual voter registration or identification, what bills cross the finish line can go back and forth. It allows for a really thoughtful and in my opinion, a spirit of reaching across the political aisle. And then the final note I'd make on this slide for you is that the speaker and committee chairs, as I said, really matter in terms of deciding which bills are going to be moving forward expeditiously. And those positions of authority are voted on by the entire legislature on the first day of session. Historically, this has been done in a secret ballot to emphasize the nonpartisan nature of the body. Legislators vote by secret ballot for who should lead these committees, and it has historically, again, panned out that committee chairs and speakers have been on both sides of the political aisle. And then after those positions of authority are determined, the committees are formally designated thereafter. And those committee lists, you'll see there's a hot link in here. We tried, connecting my computer somehow so I could follow the link and show you, which didn't work too well. But you should be able to go ahead and click that link and see when you get to the home page of the Nebraska legislature where to find the last year's committee lists. And then once committees are formally designated for 2017, that list will be updated on that home page. So that's a little bit about who makes up the legislature, and now this is kind of the timeline of the unicameral and how legislative bodies move. So each legislature is made up of 2 sessions over a 2-year period. The first session in odd-numbered years is a long session, 90 days. It goes from approximately January through early June. And then the second session in the even-numbered years, so 2018 will be the next one, is a short session, which goes from approximately January through April. Short session is 60 days, so that January through April includes some recess days. Long session this year, 90 days. January through June includes some recess days as well. Session always begins on the first Wednesday after the first Monday in January of every year. So this year, day 1 is going to be January 4th of 2017, the first Wednesday. And then the time in between sessions, so from approximately June to January or from approximately April to January, is called the interim period. And during that time, committees study issues. Senators can bring about 5 legislative resolutions to study a particular issue to get questions answered on something. And then those interim study resolutions are designated to committees, and committees have hearings even over the interim in the summer and in the fall, kind of looking at the answers to those questions, getting expert advice on these issues. Once session begins, bills have to be dropped early. So bills have to be introduced within the first 10 days of session. This year, I think the 10th day is going to be something like the 18th of January, 18th or 19th of January. So what that means is senators have already started planning what bills they are bringing. Most of them have already been actually drafted in the formal language of legislative change with the bill revisor's office. And then in those first 10 days, the senators actually bring them to the floor and they get assigned a number. And then they get assigned to a committee. So whichever committee is the most appropriate standing committee to hear a bill, it'll get assigned. The committee chair will decide on a hearing date. And then just as a general matter, bills that move out of committee pretty quickly usually have the best chance of advancing further during that session. Because there's no limit on the number of bills a senator can bring, and because every bill gets a hearing, this can
The caller
have frost.
Has joined the conference.
Sometimes late into the night, sometimes every day late into the night in the first couple of months of session. And it means that bills that the committees hear the earliest and just vote on and decide to move out to the floor have the most possible time during the session to actually be discussed and debated. So with that, each senator can choose one bill to be a priority bill. Committees, each committee gets 2 priority bills, and the speaker gets up to 25 priority bills. Priority status bill means that it gets bumped ahead of other bills in debate. So say a senator has a bill that's their most important to them. They decide to prioritize it. Even if it gets out of the committee later than another bill does, it may still get heard sooner than that other bill because the priority is saying this gets to jump to the front of the line. Especially in short session, this becomes really important when there's only those 60 days on the calendar. The simple fact of the matter is that every bill that gets out of committee there's just not time for it all to be heard and discussed. Particularly if there are people filibustering bills. The time goes really quickly. So even bills that have a priority designation sometimes might not get heard. That's very rare. The speaker works very hard to make sure every priority bill does get its moment on the floor. But especially in short session, I guess the takeaway is if you have a bill you really care about, you want to see a senator prioritize it or get it lumped into a package coming out of a committee that has a committee priority designation. As I said, the speaker is elected by the senators on the first day of session. There are 2 senators running for speaker this year, Senator Williams and Senator Scheer, and they have been campaigning over the interim, and so one of them will be elected on day 1, and that speaker position not only gets 25 priority bills, but gets to set the daily agenda and the calendar for the session. So it's obviously an extremely important position. And this calendaring system means that it's important to be strategic when you reach out. We'll get more into this as we move to the next section of the PowerPoint. But if you contact senators too early, they might not even know about a bill yet. If it's still in committee and they're not on that committee, it may just not even be on their radar, given that they have hundreds of other bills they're considering or hearing about. So what you want to do is follow the calendar, contact the committee clerk to find out when a particular bill is being considered or voted on in committee, in order to know when your best moment to reach out to committee senators are. Or then once a bill has moved out of committee to the floor, you can reach out to the Speaker's office to try and find out when it's going to be initially scheduled for debate. But more on this later. So the final thing you want to know about the unicameral is that we have pretty short term limits. I like to say that I think Nebraska is a political scientist's dream. We have this really interesting cocktail of one house, nonpartisan, short-term limits, which I think makes for a recipe for law to get passed fairly easily, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, because we have a constant influx of new senators who are eager to pass legislation. It's nonpartisan. There are no whips saying yes, no, yes, no. And it's only one house that bills have to move through and then get approved by the governor. So senators can only serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms, and then they have to wait another 4 years before they could run again for another consecutive set of 2 4-year terms. So what this means this year in particular is that about 2/3 of our incoming legislature is going to have 2 years or less of experience in the legislature. And at least 11, I didn't do the counting right before putting this presentation together after the election. I think it's 14 are going to be freshman senators. This is their first year. And then also many individuals who've been legislative leaders, so the Speaker, the Judiciary Committee Chair, the HHS Committee Chair, are term limited or weren't reelected, and so they are leaving, and we'll be seeing fresh leadership come in this particular session. And the takeaway from that is that your expertise and perspective really matters. When you have relatively short term limits, there is no way even the most intelligent or educated or thoughtful person could understand and know everything about every issue that comes before the legislature. So a lot of expertise is housed in the legislative staff, in the lobbyists who are there for the longer term, and then in the individuals who come forward to share what they know about particular issue areas. So I can't underscore enough how accessible our senators are, how interested they are in hearing from individuals in the field on these issues who actually have the direct experience and knowledge, and how your voice, bringing your voice into the legislature, can make a real difference. So that is our introduction to the unicameral, and if there are questions on that, I could answer them right now. I don't see any down in the queue right now. Then I will move on to getting bills to be heard and getting bills to pass into law. Oh shoot, so there is supposed to be a picture here that isn't showing up, at least for me. Oh well, of how a bill becomes law in Nebraska. It's an infographic. You can probably see it on the PowerPoint if you download it, or you can go to the Voices for Children website and like Google search the How a Bill Becomes a Law in Nebraska infographic. But the shorthand is it gets introduced, it goes to a committee, it gets out of committee, and it gets heard 3 times on the floor. It gets 3 opportunities for debate. Each time for debate is a slightly shorter time period, so up to 8 hours the first time, up to 6 hours the second time, up to 2 hours the third time. And then if it gets voted through all the way, then it needs to be signed by the governor. If the governor won't sign it within a week, it comes back to the legislature for a veto override that requires a supermajority of senators. And if they do so, then it still passes into law. So that's the shorthand of a bill becoming a law in Nebraska. So walking you through how do you take these steps? What do you do? If you have an idea for a change to the law that you think would be really important based on your expertise, you're going to want to start early. You need to present your idea to a senator. A good place to start is your local representative, whoever you are a constituent for. They're usually very responsive to hearing from constituents. And even if that senator doesn't feel that interested in the issue or doesn't have a lot of expertise, they are very willing to point you to other senators to reach out to who might be. So summer is actually a great time to start because the legislature is not in session. They have a little more time. And this is usually when they start preparing their slates for what their issues are going to be that they're bringing the next year. As I said, it can be a good idea to start with your home senator. And if you know of a different senator with expertise in the area, go to them. Otherwise, your home senator can help you figure that out. And you're going to do a lot of work with the senator's staff. So present any research that you've gathered, tell your story of, why this matters to you, why you've been thinking about this, why you have expertise in the area. And then you can work with the legislative staff to draft language changing our statute and bring that draft language to a bill drafter in the revisor's office, who will make sure that anything you bring, they'll sort of do the I dotting and the T crossing to make sure that it flows with the rest of our code. And one thing I want to add here is that if you bring a senator an idea, if you're really starting this process, they are going to need and expect you to follow through all the way, including being present to publicly testify in support. So it's not something to just toss off and assume that they'll take the reins on the rest of the way. It's important that you're prepared to be there and put in the time on it as it moves forward. So just as a political note, if you work for a private or public agency, you are still entitled to work on legislation and testify in your private capacity as a citizen with your life experiences, but you may want to give your employer a heads up that you're working on this, and certainly at a public hearing you'll need to be careful to clarify that you're not speaking and representing your organization unless you've had explicit approval to do that. So, supporting or opposing legislation. As I said, every single introduced bill gets a public hearing before an assigned committee, and anyone in Nebraska, or out of Nebraska even, can come to testify in support, opposition, or a neutral capacity to give the legislators information about that particular bill. And senators, as I said, really want to hear what you have to say. There are only 49 of them, and they are all very responsive to contacts. We'll talk about how to do all these contacts later. And as I said, a good place to start is to find your local representative. So if you don't already know who your state senator is, this is the link you click to. You can put in your address and find who your representative is, along with all of their...
The caller
Frost.
has left the conference.
along with all of their legislative contact information. So before the hearing, say you've been following a bill, you want to know when the public hearing is, you want to know what to do in order to support it or oppose it. Hearing dates are going to be available at the legislative website. There is a calendar, there is a link to look at scheduled committee hearings, and you go and you click those links to follow through and see, just keep updated on what committees are hearing what bills when. The order, so the committee will hear several hearings on a given afternoon, or they'll hear several different bills on a given afternoon, and they'll typically be listed in order of how they'll be heard, usually starting at 1 p.m., but that can also change. So if you know your committee, your bill is scheduled on, say, January 23rd, and it's at 1 p.m. in front of the HHS committee, and it's listed first, you can probably assume that it's going to start right at 1 p.m., and if you're not there, you may just miss it. But sometimes they get moved around that day if a senator really wants to be present and is stuck in a different committee meeting or something like that. So yours may actually get moved to the bottom of the list, and then you've arrived at 1 or before, but it turns out you might actually end up being there till 8 p.m. So be prepared. You need to decide in advance based on that information, if you are able and willing to be present in person. I can't say enough, I do think it's really important to be there in person. When you send letters, and I'll go over that in another minute, but when you send a letter instead of being present in person, it just doesn't have the same impact. Senators are inundated with paperwork on all of these different pieces of legislation they're considering. And they may scan over a letter, but it doesn't have the same sense of importance as when you're actually there, a human in person, talking to them, and they can ask you questions and you can respond. So if you are going to come in person, bring about 10 to 12 copies of any of your testimony written down for the committee members and their staff. And as you're going about preparing your testimony, my best tips are it needs to be concise, it needs to have relevant facts, and it needs to not wander on in fits of emotion one way or the other. Recognizing that politics is personal and legislation can be personal, it's important to be able to tell your story in a moving but timely way. Most committees only allow you 3 minutes for each speaker, and there's a light system that will come on. So it's a good idea to practice your testimony in advance to make sure that you're not going to be running over the time, because they will cut you off. And then the other thing is, if you are working with others who are also planning to testify on a particular bill, it's a good idea to do some coordination in advance. So figuring out what your best lineup is of who's going to testify in what order, who's going to be your starter, your lead off, giving kind of the big picture, and then who's going to be your anchor, who's best prepared to answer any questions that may have come up along the way. And on that, I will also say that if there's a bill you would like to support or oppose, but you don't know what other work has been done on it, what's been going on behind the scenes, you should contact the sponsoring senator's office and try to talk to their legislative aide to find out if there is some advocacy group involved on the issue that you can work with. And then you can reach out to that group with your contact information and your story, and they can get you hooked in with any of this coordinating work that's ongoing around the issue or the bill. That was preparing for hearing. What to do actually at the committee hearing. So obviously show up on time and show up with an excess of caution of what on time means, just in case, even if your bill is scheduled second, like I said, it might go first. So it's a good idea to come at or before when the committee is scheduled to meet and just be prepared to be there for the afternoon. As you come in the door, sheets are going to be provided at the doorways for you to put your name and contact information down, and you have to hand one of these sheets to the clerk before you testify. The committee chair will start the hearing by explaining any particular housekeeping rules of their committee. And as I said, they can differ by committee chair. Some are more or less flexible on timing and the light system. But for the most part, you can pretty much count on being timed, and the light system will give you green light. That means you're good to go. Yellow light means you have a minute left. And then red light means you're over your time and you really need to stop at the end of your sentence. Always before you begin your testimony, you will need to state and spell your name so that the record keeper can get it down for the record. And then you should be flexible with your oral testimony, especially if you're going later in a hearing. Sometimes having too much of the same testimony can backfire on a bill. You want senators to get the information they need to get and to share your perspective. But also, they're long days, and they can, these senators might be staying late that night on several bills. They may have stayed late every night that week, and so brevity is highly valued, so trying not to repeat points that previous testifiers have made. And then, of course, in politeness, thanking them for their time and consideration. So if you aren't able to testify in person, recognizing that not everyone has afternoons and evenings to spare in Lincoln, Nebraska, you can submit your written testimony. You need to send it to the committee clerk through email. And you can, go onto the legislative website, figure out who the committee chair is, and call their office to get an email address. You could send it along with someone to submit it in person at the hearing, or you could go if you want to go and watch but not speak up. You can hand it in at the hearing. And then you should, if you're sending an email or if you are handing it in, you need to tell them whether you would like your testimony to be included in the official record, which means it will be published in the committee statement that you supported, opposed, or were neutral on this particular testimony. That's really important, actually, because with written testimony, if you're not there presenting on the oral record, if you don't say, yes, I would like it to be included in the official record, it won't be. And then other senators, when the bill gets moved out to the floor, if it gets moved out to the floor, won't have any knowledge of this written testimony that you submitted or that you even weighed in on the bill. So in the act of writing a letter, here is what we recommend you include. Obviously, introduce yourself. And if you're writing to a particular senator and you are a constituent, identify yourself as such. You want to explain the issue and your position on it pretty succinctly and definitely include relevant facts and personal experiences. As a policy coordinator at a nonprofit, my testimony is always to the big picture. We look at the data, we look at the research, we look at, the law and, what's actually going on in the courtroom versus in the statute, which I think is important and senators appreciate. But I can tell you from experience, it is not nearly as effective as someone coming forward to tell their personal story of what has happened to them and why the change to legislation would be important to prevent other people experiencing that. You want to, if you're writing to an individual senator, thank them for their time and attention. If you're writing to the committee, thank the committee. Make sure to include your contact information because senators can and do follow up. They want to get more information or they want to thank you for expressing yourself. So make sure to have that good contact info in there. It also makes your testimony more credible. And then obviously, don't accuse or threaten. Make sure you're using factual information. We've certainly seen in our work, we've had experiences where people, they might have a really good idea or a really important bill, but it doesn't get across the finish line just because of the way that it's presented and the way a person comes off in testifying. So senators don't respond well to threats, is the long and the short of that. And then, so if you're sending it to the committee, you can have just the same copy for the entire committee. But if you are sending letters to multiple senators on the same issue, make sure to address each individually and try to personalize the letter if you happen to know anything about them or their district. The other way another way you can advocate on bills is either to the committee or to the body as a whole, or to individual senators, obviously email. We live in the age of email. So my recommendation is prepare it just as you would with a letter. So all the same things in there as a formal letter. And they often will respond very quickly. I like this, except for Senator Chambers. Don't really expect an answer from Senator Chambers, but also don't assume that since you haven't heard from Senator Chambers, he's not read your email and strongly considered it. Again, on this, don't just mass email. Send and address each email individually that you're sending. Senators want the information that you're sharing, but also don't want to feel like they're just on a listserv. With that, I forgot to say, I also recommend CCing the senator's legislative aide on your email. The legislative aides do a lot of the internal processing work and helping their senators parse all of the hundreds of bills that they're hearing about. So, so sometimes the senator might have so many emails coming in they miss some, but the aide has more time during the day. They don't have to be on the floor. They can be on top of it. So when you go on the website to get your senator's contact information, see if you can find their legislative aide's email as well, or give the office a call and ask for the LA's email to CC on your email. Finally, making a phone call. This is like old, I feel a little bit 1950s saying, call your senators, but it's tried and true, right? Especially in Nebraska where there are so few of them and they really are responsive, want to be responsive to the will of the people in Nebraska. So, of course, introduce yourself. And again, if you are a constituent, it's especially important that they know that because they really do care what their constituents think. You may well talk to a staff member. In fact, I would almost guarantee you're probably going to be talking to a staff member because the senators spend all of their day either on the floor of the legislature or in the committee hearings that they are assigned to. Be brief, again, non-threatening, friendly, informative. Offer to send follow-up materials or to be available for follow-up questions. Make sure to give them your email and your phone contact info so they can follow up. And, of course, as always, thank them for their time and attention. That's legislative advocacy. Are there any questions on that piece before I move on to staying informed? Don't see any in the chat, so that's all a lot of information that I just heaped on you. As I said, the PowerPoint is going to be available on NJJA's website, so you can always check back to it if you're thinking about going to a committee hearing as a reminder of what you need to bring with you and our kind of tips on it. But that said, it can be a full-time job to follow the Nebraska legislature. It is my full-time job during session to follow the Nebraska legislature and figure out what is going on with them when and what bills are being heard when, and recognizing that all of you probably have other full-time jobs. It can be a lot. It can be a lot to follow. Oh, I do see a question. Let me see if it makes sense to answer this right now. Okay. So if a bill makes it out of committee, this is a great question. Thank you, Marcy. But isn't prioritized, is there a chance it could get past that session? And if not, do bills get reintroduced every session? So it matters what point in the biennium you are. So we're starting a new legislature this year, 2017, and it's a long session. All the senators will introduce their bills in the first 10 days. and then later in the session they'll choose their priorities. Long session, there is more time, so there are and may well be bills that do get heard and debated on the floor that didn't have a priority because there's just more time for it. If a bill gets out of committee during the first session, the long session in the odd-numbered year, but doesn't get a chance to be heard on the floor that year during long session, it gets carried over until 2018, until the even-numbered short session year. So sometimes there's a legislative strategy to bring a bill during the long session, try just work that year on getting it out of committee, getting it kicked out to the floor, not prioritizing it, and then working the next session to get it heard early, to have an early floor debate on it in the very first days of the second short session. So bills don't get automatically reintroduced every session. There can be these carryover bills between long session and short session. And then, like I said, senators each have 4-year terms. So say a senator brings a bill in the first year of their 4-year term, and it gets carried over, not heard during the second year of their 4-year term. They can choose if they want to reintroduce it again in the next long session or in the next short session before they are running for re-election and hoping to get re-elected. And then we have a follow-up question. Can that bill be joined? Oh, shoot. Can that bill be joined in with a priority bill for passage? Yes. So another great point that I should have made, which is that bills can and often are, can be and often are amended together. And that happens in a couple different ways. Sometimes committees will do that if they hear a number of bills that are on or about the same general subject matter. And we actually often see this in juvenile justice in the Judiciary Committee. They'll hear 4 or 5 bills related to juvenile justice issues, and then they may, in their committee talks, sort of bind them together, and they'll send it out to the floor of the legislature with a committee amendment saying, there's this underlying bill that's the carry-all bill, but we're amending all these other 5 bills onto it, and this is our Judiciary Committee package that we want the legislature to consider. So that's one way. Another way is senators can attempt to amend their bills onto other bills, other priority bills, as the session goes along. And there's really, this frequently happens, frequently. A challenge can be brought as to germaneness. So if one senator has prioritized a certain bill and they have been talking to another senator about getting that senator's bill amended onto it so that it gets heard, someone else can come in and say, hey, I don't think that bill you're trying to amend onto the underlying bill is actually germane to the issue. They're totally unrelated. They shouldn't be amended together. And then the speaker kind of makes a decision about that germaneness issue and whether it's appropriate to amend the bills together. So there are certainly ways, even if a bill doesn't get a priority, to still get it. There's a chance it can still be heard even without a priority, either in that session or if it's a carryover. B, to work on getting it amended into a package or onto another bill that does have a priority. So I think that added that. And then Mary has a great comment that you do need to be aware if you're presenting at a committee hearing, it's a public hearing. It's a public record. It's going to go onto the public legislative transcript. Your name will be in there and your testimony will be in there for all the world to see. And news media certainly attend, especially on if there are hot button issues. And so news media may approach you after a hearing to get some follow-up information or get your contact information. Okay, anything else? No, thank you for those questions and comments. So as I was saying, this can all seem like a lot, and especially as you think about bills getting amended into other bills, or are they going to be heard, or are they not going to be heard, when are they going to be heard? It can be sort of complicated. So that's where we come in for you. How do you stay on top of what's happening? If you are interested in bills relating to child welfare, juvenile justice, economic stability or poverty issues, including how our public systems, our public safety net systems work, health, mostly related to children's health insurance issues, but also hunger, we do some advocacy work in education, but less so. Then I recommend you sign up for our listserv called Advocate. You can click this link here, and here's what we do. During session, we send out weekly email blasts that are highlighting what is happening right now in the Nebraska legislature on these issues. We track all of the bills that are related to these issues, but we highlight ones that we think are priorities, ones that we are working actively on, as I said, particularly in these issue areas, and then we will do the work for you of identifying when it's coming to committee hearing, who the right people are to be in touch with if you want to reach out and contact them, when it's coming to the floor to be debated, so when is a good time to talk to senators, to do those calls and emails saying, hey, I care about this, and we kind of do that tracking for you. So you can sign up for Advocate and get that information. And then the other thing is, if you are interested in hearing from the horse's mouth what is happening this year during session, Tom and NJJA have graciously asked me to do another presentation in January, specifically on juvenile justice legislation. So at the end of January, we will know for sure all of the bills related to juvenile justice that have been brought that are going to be considered. And we'll be able to give you a deep dive into what those bills seek to do and what any upcoming dates for them are going to be, if they've been assigned to committees, if they have hearing dates yet, etc. So I would encourage you to join us, follow NJJA to know when that's going to be happening, and come out and join us again. And here's my contact information too. If you think of any questions or want to do some follow-up, please always feel free to reach out. And I've also given you our social media on here. If you want to give us a follow, we will again keep our followers posted on any upcoming legislation through Facebook, Twitter, etc. We've got about 9 minutes left. Are there any other questions about anything I've gone through? Doesn't look like anyone's typing anything. As I said, we will post this PowerPoint. You've got my contact information if you think of follow-ups. Oh, we've got a couple typists. Thanks. All right. Well, it doesn't look like we've got any questions, so just thank you all again, and thank you to NJJA for asking me to present today. I hope it's been helpful for everyone.
Thank you, Juliet, for your presentation and getting us all up to speed on our legislative processes. It was a great introduction, and for those involved in the process for some time, it was a terrific refresher. We also would like to thank Voices for collaborating in this training process, but especially thank you, Juliet, for your tireless efforts on behalf of Nebraska's young people and their families. For those of you who are joining on this event, thank you. Please watch for more announcements of upcoming NJJA-sponsored web-based training events on a variety of topics. This concludes our presentation. We encourage you to also plan your schedule so you can attend the annual NJJA conference to be held again in Kearney, Nebraska on May 17th, 18th, and 19th, 2017. On behalf of everyone at the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association, thank you.